Today's pattern is an elegant table runner and it comes from Simplicity 5530. It's a table runner with 2 placemats and it really is easy to sew. The technique I'm going to demonstrate is how to add the framed border, and it is surprisingly easy. The view I'm making, view B, actually calls for pre-quilted fabric, which is double-sided. I wanted to use a silk, so I've done that myself. What I've done is I've cut out 2 layers and some wadding, which I've then stitched. So I've put the wadding in the middle, the fabric outside edges on the outside, and then stitched repeatedly down in rows to create my own pre-quilted fabric. The first thing to do then is to get the pattern instruction sheet out of the envelope and have a look and see what you need, what pieces you need to construct the view that you're going to make. So for this I'm going to use pieces 1 and 2, that'll make the mat and the runner, and I'm also using 3, 4, 5 and 6 to do the borders. Having seen those, I get the tissue out and cut them out, but I'm not going to cut them out really neatly. I'm just going to cut them out roughly with a little bit of excess tissue on the edges, which is not a problem at all. In fact, it's really handy when you're using silky fabrics, as I have been, because what I want to do is I want to be able to cut through the tissue as well as the fabric, which helps grip the fabric when it's very slippery, so it's really handy. So the first step is to join the border sections together. Firstly, I've turned under the inner edge, this is to the wrong side, by 1 centimetre, as it says in the pattern instructions. Press that in place, done that on all 4 of the pieces. And then I've joined them together. So I've joined them right sides together, matching my notches. I always cut the notches out, it's always a good thing to do. And they're used to match the pieces, and you want to match them perfectly. So I've done that all the way round and pressed it open, and what I now have is the frame. So that's the wrong side. If I turn it over, you can see I've got beautifully mitered corners without having a problem making them beautiful. All I've done is join the pieces together. I'm now pinning my border to the wrong side of my placemat, so the right sides of the border and the wrong side of the placemat are together. And pin it all the way round, and I'm going to stitch all the way round, again taking a centimetre seam allowance, but it does tell me that on the pattern instructions, so I know what seam allowance to take. I'm going to stitch, and I'm starting not at a corner, I'm starting sort of midway down one side edge. It's always better not to start at a corner because it gives more strength when you do the overlap. Stitching all the way round, and I'm using the edge of the presser foot as my guide because I've moved the needle to give me a centimetre seam. And the way to move the needle, if you're not sure, is when you're working on a straight stitch, you use the stitch width button to move the needle to the left or right. Just make sure that the presser foot will go along the edge when I sew the next one. So I'm just doing the needle by hand, and now I'm ready to go along the next row. And as I get to the corner, what I do is I stop with the needle down, raise the presser foot and pivot the fabric. I'm back to the beginning again, so I'm just going to continue stitching to overlap those stitches, back stitch a little to lock them in, and then that's ready to cut off. The next stage is to trim back the seam allowance, cut the corners at an angle so that when you turn it through you get a nice crisp corner. You just trim it back to about half the width of the seam allowance, so it ends up being sort of about 6 millimetres, quarter of an inch. Trim it all the way round. So I'm turning it through and pushing the corners out using a point turner. Point turner has a little point on it, so if you haven't got a little point turner like this, you can of course use a knitting needle or even a kebab stick. So I'm ready, I've pressed it nicely, so the seam is right on the edge there. And I'm now going to stitch along the inner edge of the border so that I can fix that to the front. And this time I am going to start at the corner because I want the join to be invisible. So I'm going to stitch on the spot. If you can't do that, you can back stitch, of course, to anchor that stitching. And again, I've moved the needle right over so that I can use the edge of the presser foot as my guide and stitch really close to that edge. Because I've stitched on the spot, I can cut my thread tails close to the stitching. If I hadn't been able to stitch on the spot, the thing to do would be to take the thread tails through to the back with a hand needle and then thread them between the layers to cut them off. So there it is, all stitched all around and finished. Very, very, very quick.